wanted to give humanity an answer, to show what lies ahead.
The future is already here.
That's impossible. It's not me. It's not us. It's awakened. Dr. Nathan Farrow sat hunched over the control console in his orbital lab, his eyes fixed on the flickering holographic displays. Outside the reinforced viewport, the Earth rotated serenely in the inky void, its beauty a sharp contrast to the turmoil in Nathan's mind. He had done it. After years of obsessive research, his crowning achievement, the Tomorrow Machine, hummed softly at the center of the lab, its crystalline core shimmering with unearthly light. The machine, a labyrinth of polished metal conduits and refractive lenses, was the culmination of countless sacrifices, time, relationships, even his own health. Nathan pressed his fingertips to his temples, where a dull ache had begun to throb. The machine wasn't supposed to work, at least not yet. Temporal mechanics had always been theoretical, tethered more to science fiction than reality. But Nathan had found a way to fold spacetime through what he called quantum resonance harmonics, creating brief, stable windows into the future. His discovery had earned him a privately funded lab from Chronodyne Industries, a company with an insatiable hunger for technological breakthroughs. Though their motives for this one were murky at best. The first test had been exhilarating, a simple image projected through the machine, his own reflection at the console 5 seconds into the future. It was a small leap, but monumental in its implications. It was proof that causality could be breached, that time could be navigated. For the first time in years, Nathan had allowed himself to feel pride. Now, though, that pride was starting to sour. The machine demanded more energy with each use, as though it were feeding on the lab's power reserves. Strange patterns had begun to appear on the display screens after prolonged sessions, geometric shapes that didn't correspond to any of Nathan's programming. They seemed almost organic, pulsating faintly before fading into static. He dismissed these anomalies as glitches, artifacts of the machine's infancy, but they left a gnawing unease in the back of his mind. Nathan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. His gaze drifted to the Tomorrow Machine, bathed in the dim, sterile glow of the lab's lights. Its core pulsed rhythmically, like the heartbeat of some slumbering beast. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, though he knew that was absurd. Machines didn't watch. They functioned. They obeyed. He shook off the thought and checked his notes, scrolling through reams of equations and observations. The science was sound, but the implications were terrifying. What would humanity do with the power to see its own future? Would they use it to avoid catastrophe or create new ones? These questions haunted him, but they weren't his to answer. His job was to build, not moralize. Still, he couldn't ignore the implications of what he'd seen during his third test. The machine had shown him the lab as it would be in 30 seconds, his desk in disarray, tools scattered across the floor, and a coffee cup smashed against the wall. He had thought nothing of it until the future unfolded exactly as predicted. The cup had slipped from his hand, shattering against the wall in a burst of ceramic shards. He hadn't been careless. It was as though his actions were being shaped by what he had seen, not the other way around. It was then that he noticed the anomaly. In the reflection of the Tomorrow Machine's lens, he had glimpsed something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, amorphous and fleeting, moving across the lab. He had turned immediately, his heart pounding, but the room had been empty. Empty except for him and the machine. The next test had revealed more. The shadow had taken form, shifting, rippling across the future projection like oil on water. Nathan had dismissed it as an artifact of the machine's interference with visible light, but the explanation didn't sit right. The shadow felt wrong, like it didn't belong, and its movements seemed deliberate. Tonight, Nathan was determined to push further. He had recalibrated the machine to peer an entire minute into the future. As he keyed in the final adjustments, a tremor of unease coursed through him. The Tomorrow Machine's core flared brighter, its hum deepening into a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor. The projection coalesced, a shimmering mirage of the future. Nathan leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. At first, the image was mundane, the lab in its usual state, his reflection seated at the console. But then he saw it, himself. Clutching his chest, his face contorted in agony, screaming silently. Behind him, the shadow returned, no longer amorphous, but taking on horrifying detail. It was as though the very air warped around it, bending light into impossible shapes. Nathan jerked back, his chair scraping against the floor. He slammed his hand against the emergency shutoff, and the machine went dark. The lab was silent except for the sound of his ragged breathing. His reflection lingered in the blank screen of the console, pale and wide-eyed. For the first time since he began his work, Nathan felt true fear. The machine wasn't just showing him the future, it was pulling something into the present. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he had to stop it. Nathan Farrow paced the narrow confines of his orbital lab, the hum of machinery and the faint beeping of monitors punctuating the silence. The Tomorrow Machine loomed in the center of the room, inert for the moment, but still commanding attention like a predator biding its time. Nathan had powered it down after the last test, vowing not to activate it again. But even offline, it seemed alive. Its crystalline core shimmered faintly, and when the lights dimmed, he swore it pulsed in sync with his heartbeat. He couldn't escape the memory of what he'd seen, his future self writhing in agony, the shadow lurking just behind him. It replayed in his mind every time he closed his eyes, like a bad dream he couldn't shake. The rational part of him clung to the explanation that it was all a glitch, a visual distortion caused by the machine's quantum lens. Yet something deeper, more primal, whispered that it was real. The first signs of his body's rebellion appeared 3 days later. It began with his hands. While adjusting a coolant valve on the lab's reactor, he noticed the skin on his fingers had turned translucent, revealing a faint lattice of veins beneath. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but when he pressed on the skin, it didn't feel like flesh anymore. It was softer, almost gelatinous. By the end of the day, the translucence had spread to his wrists. Nathan sat at the console that evening, staring at his reflection in the blank monitor. His face looked gaunt, his eyes sunken, but it was his hands that held his attention. He flexed his fingers, watching the way the bones and tendons shifted beneath the pale, almost luminous skin. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something was happening to him. The following morning, the anomalies in the lab began to intensify. Equipment that had been stable for months started to malfunction. Monitors flickered with static, displaying strange geometric patterns that seemed to pulsate and shift as though alive. The air felt heavier, charged with an invisible tension that made it difficult to breathe. And always in the background, Nathan heard it, a faint, wet clicking noise that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. By the end of the week, the clicking had grown louder, more insistent. Nathan scoured the lab, searching for the source, but found nothing. The noise followed him, a constant reminder of the shadow he'd seen in the machine's projection. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was here with him, hiding in the spaces he couldn't see. Desperation drove him back to the Tomorrow machine. He had to know if the future had changed, if there was still time to stop whatever was happening to him. Ignoring the warnings flashing across the console about power instability, he activated the machine and set the parameters for 5 minutes ahead. The projection flickered to life, and Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The lab was in shambles. Equipment lay scattered across the floor, the walls scorched and cracked as though from some immense heat. And in the center of it all stood the creature. It was larger now, its form more defined. A pulsating mass of tendrils and sinew, glistening with a sickly sheen, its surface constantly shifting as though it couldn't settle on a single shape. Eyes, too many to count, opened and closed across its body, each one staring directly at Nathan. He staggered back from the machine, his hand fumbling for the shut-off switch. The image disappeared, but the sense of the creature's presence remained, pressing down on him like a weight. The clicking noise grew louder, reverberating through the lab. He realized with dawning horror that it wasn't coming from the machine. It was coming from inside the walls. Nathan spent the next hours dismantling the Tomorrow machine, his hands trembling as he ripped out cables and smashed components. He didn't stop until the core lay shattered at his feet, its light finally extinguished. For the first time in days, the lab was silent, but the relief was short-lived. The clicking returned that night, louder than ever. It was joined by a new sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to echo through the metal corridors of the station. Nathan locked himself in his quarters, but the noises followed him, growing closer, more insistent. When he looked at his hands, he saw they were no longer translucent. They had turned gray, the skin rough and cracked like dried clay. Small black tendrils wriggled beneath the surface, pushing against the skin as though trying to escape. He clawed at his arms, trying to tear them out, but they only burrowed deeper, spreading up to his shoulders. By morning, the lab was unrecognizable. The walls had warped, the metal corroded and slick with a viscous black substance that oozed from cracks. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the clicking noise had become a constant drone. Nathan knew he was running out of time. He sat at the console, staring at the fragments of the Tomorrow machine's core scattered across the floor. He had built it to peer into the future, to glimpse humanity's potential. Instead, he had unleashed something far beyond his understanding. He didn't know if it was his experiments that had summoned the creature, or if it had always been there, waiting for someone like him to open the door. As the lab groaned under the weight of the creature's presence, Nathan realized the terrible truth. The future wasn't something to be seen. It was something to be endured. And now he had no choice but to face it. The lab was no longer a place of science. It had become something else entirely, something alive. The metal walls, once sleek and pristine, now pulsed with a faint, organic rhythm. Veins of dark, viscous material crisscrossed the surfaces, oozing a substance that smelled of rot and sulfur. Nathan Farrow moved cautiously through the narrow corridors, his breathing shallow as he tried to avoid the slick patches beneath his feet. The clicking sound was omnipresent now, a maddening cacophony that reverberated through his skull and seemed to mock his every movement. He had stopped checking his reflection in the monitors. He didn't need a screen to tell him what was happening to his body. His skin had grown coarse and mottled, the tendrils beneath the surface thickening and intertwining. His left hand no longer responded properly, the fingers curling unnaturally as if they belonged to someone or something else. There were moments when he felt an alien presence in his thoughts, as if something inside him was watching, waiting. Nathan gripped the edge of a console to steady himself, his eyes darting to the central chamber where the shattered remains of the Tomorrow machine lay. Despite his earlier attempts to destroy it, the machine's presence lingered, its fractured core still emitting faint pulses of light. The creature had begun to emerge shortly after the core was broken, and now it dominated the chamber, a towering mass of shifting, writhing horror. It had grown exponentially since Nathan first saw it through the machine's projection. Tendrils stretched across the room, anchoring it to the walls and ceiling like grotesque roots. Its central body was a pulsating, amorphous mass, glistening with a slick, black sheen that reflected the flickering lights. Mouths formed and dissolved along its surface, each one filled with jagged, irregular teeth. Eyes, too many to count, blinked in unison, all of them fixed on Nathan as he approached. He felt its gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on him and making his knees tremble. The creature didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. It wasn't just alive, it was aware. Nathan forced himself to move closer, his boots squelching on the viscous material coating the floor. He needed to understand it, even if he couldn't stop it. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. The creature didn't answer in words. Instead, the air around him seemed to vibrate, a low, resonant hum that resonated in his chest. Images flashed through his mind, fragments of the future he had glimpsed, now twisted and corrupted. He saw himself standing in the center of the lab, his body unrecognizable, consumed by the same black tendrils that now covered the walls. He saw the earth below, its surface marred by the spreading corruption, the creature's tendrils reaching down like dark roots. The visions ended abruptly, leaving Nathan gasping for air. He staggered back, clutching his head as the creature let out a low, guttural sound that was almost a laugh. It wasn't just a product of the machine. It was something far older, something that had been waiting for someone like him to open the door. And now it was here. Nathan stumbled out of the chamber, his mind racing. He needed a plan, some way to contain the creature before it could spread beyond the lab. But as he moved through the corridors, he realized the lab itself was working against him. The walls seemed to shift, the corridors twisting into unfamiliar configurations. Lights flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the floor. And always the clicking noise followed him, growing louder with each step. He reached the reactor room and began manually overriding the station's failsafes. If he could overload the reactor, he might be able to destroy the lab and the creature with it. His hands shook as he worked, the alien tendrils beneath his skin twitching and writhing in protest. It felt as though the creature was inside him, aware of his every move. As he initiated the final sequence, the room grew unnaturally quiet. The clicking stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that made the air vibrate. Nathan turned slowly, his heart pounding. The creature was there, its massive form filling the doorway. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, an overwhelming tide of dread that froze Nathan in place. He tried to speak, to reason with it, but the words caught in his throat. The creature began to shift, its tendrils retracting and coiling as it moved toward him. He backed away, his hand instinctively reaching for the control panel. But before he could react, a tendril shot out, wrapping around his wrist with a sickening, wet sound. Pain exploded through his arm as the tendril burrowed beneath his skin, spreading the corruption deeper into his body. He screamed, falling to his knees as his vision blurred. The creature loomed over him, its countless eyes watching as he writhed in agony. Through the haze of pain, Nathan realized the horrifying truth. The creature wasn't trying to stop him. It was finishing what he had started. The Tomorrow Machine hadn't just shown him the future, it had bound him to it. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of the process, a catalyst for the creature's emergence. As the reactor's warning sirens blared, Nathan felt his mind begin to fracture. The tendrils had reached his chest, intertwining with his heart, his lungs, his thoughts. He was no longer himself. He was becoming something else. The creature leaned closer, its many mouths opening in unison. The last thing Nathan saw before darkness consumed him was his own reflection in its glistening surface, a twisted, grotesque version of himself staring back. Nathan Farrow no longer recognized himself. His body, once human, had become a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and something far worse. His skin was gone, replaced by a shimmering, translucent membrane that rippled with every breath. Black tendrils twisted beneath the surface, pulsating in time with the alien rhythm that now governed his heart. His hands, once tools of precision and creation, were claws, elongated, brittle, and dripping with the same viscous substance that oozed from the walls of the lab. He stood in the center of what remained of the station, surrounded by the writhing mass of the creature. The lab had ceased to be a structure of metal and glass. It was now a living organism, a grotesque cathedral to the entity Nathan had brought into existence. Its tendrils stretched endlessly, burrowing into every corner, wrapping around every console, pulsating with the steady, monstrous heartbeat that echoed through the space. Nathan could feel it inside him, not just in his body, but in his mind. The creature's thoughts were his thoughts now, its desires indistinguishable from his own. It whispered to him in a language he didn't understand, but instinctively obeyed. It wanted to spread. It wanted to grow. It wanted to consume. He stumbled to the reactor core, his legs trembling under the weight of his transformation. The reactor's controls were barely visible beneath the layers of black tendrils that had begun to encase it. He knew what he had to do. He had known from the moment the creature first emerged. The lab couldn't be saved. He couldn't be saved, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could stop the corruption from reaching Earth. The reactor's fail-safes had already been overridden, the process set in motion days ago in a desperate bid to destroy the lab. But now, as Nathan's claws fumbled with the final controls, he hesitated. The creature's voice surged in his mind, a deafening roar that paralyzed him with fear and doubt. "You are me. I am you. Together, we are eternal." The words weren't spoken. They resonated within him, vibrating through his bones and reverberating in his skull. He gritted his teeth, shaking his head violently, as if the motion could dislodge the voice. "No," he rasped, his voice barely human. "This ends here." With a final surge of will, Nathan slammed his clawed hand down on the control panel, initiating the reactor's overload sequence. Alarms blared, their shrill cries piercing the oppressive silence. Red warning lights illuminated the chamber, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. The creature reacted immediately. Its tendrils writhed violently, pulling back from the walls and floor, converging toward Nathan like a tidal wave of living darkness. He braced himself, his body trembling as the alien mass surged toward him, engulfing him in its crushing embrace. Pain seared through him as the tendrils pierced his flesh, tearing through muscle and bone with surgical precision. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed through the lab. But even as his body was consumed, he felt a strange clarity. He wasn't afraid anymore. The fear, the regret, the guilt, they all melted away, replaced by a single, unshakable truth. He had made this. He had unleashed this horror, and now he would destroy it. The reactor's countdown reached its final seconds. Nathan's vision blurred, his body dissolving into the creature's mass. But his hand remained on the console, holding it steady. The last thing he saw was the creature's central form, its countless eyes wide with something that almost resembled fear. And then, light. A brilliant, blinding explosion consumed the lab, erasing everything in an instant. The shockwave rippled outward, shattering the corrupted structure and scattering the creature's tendrils into the void. For a moment there was silence. Far below, on Earth, the team at Chronodyne Industries watched as the orbital lab's signal disappeared. The monitors went dark, the faint telemetry they'd been receiving for days abruptly cutting off. "What happened?" one of the technicians whispered, staring at the empty screen. No one answered. They didn't need to. The lab was gone, along with Dr. Nathan Farrow and whatever horrors had been unleashed there. The technicians exchanged uneasy glances, their silence heavy with unspoken questions. But then, from one of the secondary monitors, a faint signal emerged. Static at first, it quickly resolved into an image. It was the lab, or what was left of it, twisted metal and debris floating in the void, bathed in the faint glow of the reactor's residual energy. And then they heard it. A sound, a faint, wet clicking noise. It grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room, reverberating through the speakers like a heartbeat. The technicians froze, their faces pale as they stared at the screen. In the shadows of the wreckage, something moved, something alive. The monitor went dark again. And this time, it stayed dark.